Hi book lovers! Today I wanted to talk about two popular novels that I've read recently. Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros and The Bookbinder of Jericho by Pip Williams. And they're two very different books, very different genres, very different writing styles. Fourth Wing is a fantasy, a fairly recent bestseller. I believe the sequel is out now and the third in the trilogy comes out early next year. They're about dragons, they're high fantasy, romantasy as well. Lots of steamy romance in here, lots of battles. Whereas this is a historical fiction, a reading group kind of book. Although it does talk about some really big themes and it also deals with war. It's a much quieter read, it's a much more character-driven read. It basically explores the lives of a young woman during the First World War. And it's very much about her job at a bookbindery, her personal relationships with World War I as a kind of backdrop. Whereas this one is about a young woman in a fantasy world who is kind of forced by her family to go to military college to become a dragon rider. And it's about the adventures that she has while she's there. She uncovers a big conspiracy. There's a lot of battles. Like I said, there's a really steamy romance. It's a very different book. But one thing they do have in common is that they both attempt disability/autism representation. I just want to make it clear, I know that not all autistic people identify as disabled. Autism is a spectrum, and so whether the symptoms are disabling or not can vary from person to person and also on the environment that you're in. But autism does generally fall under the umbrella of disabilities. And so I'm going to include them both as examples of disability representation. They also both have varied characters with different disabilities in. I think one of these books does the representation very well, and one of them is really problematic, which surprised me because, as I said, this is more commercial fiction. This is more what you would call reading group fiction, so sort of in between commercial and literary. And I don't know, given the amount of research that clearly went into this book regarding the First World War and related issues, I would have expected the representation in this book in a particular area to be better, but we'll get into that. I want to talk about Fourth Wing first. For those of you who don't know the plot, I'll very quickly recap. It's about a young woman, her name is Violet, who is forced to go into a military college. And this is about her first year learning to be a dragon rider. Comes from a very militarized country where there is sort of constant war on with the countries around her borders, and so dragon riders are absolutely crucial to the safety and defense of her country. Also, she thinks there's a whole kind of conspiracy theory plot which is uncovered towards the end of the book, and I'm sure the sequel, which I haven't read yet, will follow up on that. But I just want to make it clear, I'm not talking about how much I enjoyed the plot, how much I enjoyed the characters. I just, in this video, want to talk about the disability representation. Although I will say I did love this book. But the main character, Violet, has something called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Ehlers-Danlos syndrome is a genetic disorder that affects your connective tissue. So basically the tissue in between your joints, often most prominently, but it can also affect skin, gums, heart valves. It just, most of your body is made up of connective tissue to one degree or another. So Ehlers-Danlos syndrome is something that can also have really varying symptoms and can be more or less disabling depending on the person, the environment, at any given day, really. I also have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and that's one of the reasons I first picked this book up, because I was really excited to have a main character with this syndrome, because it is quite rare. A lot of people haven't heard of it. I believe the author herself has EDS. She does talk in the acknowledgements about she has a genetic connective tissue disorder. So I'm going to guess from that that it is indeed EDS. I think that may be one of the only genetic connective tissue disorders. Although it isn't stated, Violet's disability isn't given a name. Obviously, it's in a fantasy world. I'm going to assume, judging by the symptoms she displays, that Violet has something called hypermobility EDS, which can come with a lot of dislocations, being prone to injury, a lot of chronic pain. I've also been diagnosed with hypermobile EDS, although some of my symptoms are quite different to Violet's. I also have a lot of fatigue as well as pain, and my mobility is also affected. So I use mobility aids, whereas Violet is still able to kind of run and jump and be very mobile. She's just much more at risk of injury while doing so. So EDS, even in its subtypes, which HEDS, hypermobility EDS, is one, can really vary. So Violet is obviously not going to be representative of every single person with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Nevertheless, I thought the author did a really good portrayal with Violet. In particular, things that felt very, very validating for me was how Violet talks about herself and how she finds her disability right in the very first pages. Violet is describing how her mother disapproves of her because she's frail. And she talks about how her traitorous body makes her embarrassingly vulnerable. And that really hit home. I really felt that. The idea that your body just isn't doing what you feel it should do, and that it's almost betraying you in some way. And that feeling of being vulnerable and not wanting people to see that vulnerability, of being embarrassed by that. And Violet's feelings around her disability are not, they're not overdone in the book. So although her disability is a really important part of how Violet's story arc unfolds, it isn't always front and centre. Violet is much more than just a character with a disability. She's a fully rounded character. But you do get some really, I think, good insights into how she feels. And it's made clear how it does affect her life, and particularly how it affects her in terms of this being forced into this military college. Because the idea is that, and I will say this is quite violent fantasy fiction. There's a lot of unaliving going on. And the idea from the beginning of the book is that given Violet's obvious disadvantages in this environment, there's a good chance she's not going to make it through this first year alive. And so you start the book with really high stakes, which are kind of centered around Violet's disability. Now that may not be considered particularly realistic, but of course it is a fantasy novel. So parts of the plot are not going to be, representative of the average disabled person in today's world. But I do feel that Violet herself and her personal feelings, the personal challenges she experiences, they really did feel very realistic to me, and because of that, it just felt incredibly validating to read this. I don't think I've read books with characters with similar issues, chronic pain, chronic fatigue, needing help with mobility. I haven't ever read a book with a character with EDS, so I really kind of applaud the writer's decision to bring her lived experience to her main character. Other things that felt really affirming that I thought were really well explored were how other people in the book treat Violet, how people either tend to see her as fragile and want to protect her and overprotect her to the point that they almost try and, there's one character in it who really tries to almost coddle Violet and get her out of the military academy and try and make things much easier for her and allow her to get through the challenges without having to confront them, if that makes sense. So he wants to almost put a buffer between Violet and the world. And while disabled people do need accommodations, this sort of paternalism and I know what you need and, let me do this for you, that this character displays, the way it frustrates Violet and the way she feels that this is holding her back, I thought was incredibly realistic. I think a lot of disabled people will probably have encountered that attitude from people, often very well-meaning, loving people, but it can still feel very frustrating, and also almost as if you're being sort of infantilized slightly. There's also another character who becomes the love interest, and I had some issues with this character, but the way he treats Violet around her disability, he's very affirming of her, but also encourages her to test her limits, not in a dangerous way, and not in the sense that you should be doing more, but he almost encourages her to try doing the things she wants to do, but that she may have felt she couldn't because of the way that other people have reacted to her, if that makes sense. So he almost sort of brings her just to the edge of her comfort zone, but not in a way that is dismissive of her very real struggles. In fact, he's very protective of her. And again, I thought that was quite well done and a really good contrast to the other main male character who is very overprotective of her. Also, the way that people are, one character in particular who's definitely a villain, is very bullying of Violet, almost looks down on. You can see the kind of the way that he scorns her because he feels that she's weaker, because he senses that she's vulnerable. And this happens to disabled people in society too, most definitely, and can lead to some real atrocities against disabled people. So I thought that the mixture of how people in this environment react to Violet was very well done. Also, something that I really liked to see in this book and that I thought was done well was how Violet does need accommodations. And that's just seen as something that is obviously perfectly natural. You know, there's nothing wrong with her having accommodations. She's disabled. They allow her to be on a level playing field with the other people in her college. So probably the biggest example of that is where Violet is given a special, or rather her dragon is given a special saddle that makes it easier for Violet to keep her seat on the dragon, because her issues with her hypermobility and her balance make it much harder for her to stay on her seat. So rather than this being sort of coddling or special treatment, this is a way to level the playing field between Violet and her competitors. And obviously these are the things that disabled people need. This reflects accommodations that disabled people may need in the real world, the non-fantasy world. And so I thought the way that that was brought into this world was very well done. Also, the way that Violet finds flexible adaptations to challenges was very good. I mean, granted, one of her flexible solutions is poisoning people, which obviously don't try that at home. But again, it is a fantasy world. But just that sense that Violet knows that in some way she's at a disadvantage. But she doesn't just kind of accept that and say, well, you know, I'm not going to be able to do this thing. She kind of finds workarounds. And of course, in society, it shouldn't always be down to the disabled people to desperately find workarounds. We need society to kind of put those workarounds in place for us. But the way that I think Violet shows so much resilience and determination in the face of all these very real and frightening challenges, again, I thought was just really validating and affirming. The author managed to do that and to make that kind of a central part of Violet's character development without ever making it feel that there was anything wrong with Violet being disabled, that it was something that Violet needed to get over, you know, or be fixed or be cured. It was never presented like that. It was always presented as this is this thing about Violet that's intrinsic to Violet, that you know, it's not going to go away. We need to make this environment adapt to her so that she can fully partake in it. And this, of course, is what disabled people need in the world. And there was also a minor character who was deaf. And again, I thought the way that was portrayed was done very well. Obviously, I'm not deaf, so I can't speak from lived experience there, but it felt again as if it was portrayed as something that was important, but was also natural. It wasn't like, look at this deaf character over here. It was like, this is this character, this is who this character is, what she does. Also, she's deaf. It would be really good if this other character would learn sign language so they can communicate. I thought it was done really well. The book just flowed. The moments when the disability was discussed or made part of the story never jarred. It just all felt very natural. To read this kind of disability representation as a disabled person, and I think this would feel particularly validating, not just to people with EDS, but to anyone with mobility issues, issues with their joints, issues with injuring easily, certainly issues with chronic pain, but really any disability that kind of affects the way they feel about themselves and move in the world, which I suppose is all of us. I think would probably find this book quite affirming. And that brings me on to the Bookbinder of Jericho. I was kind of so disappointed that I found the representation in this book so problematic. because in other ways, this is a wonderful book. Pip Williams is a fantastic writer. I found that her writing just flowed. She had a beautiful style. It was very pared down, yet she also managed to say so much. Like, this is just writing goals for me. She has a beautiful writing style. Other parts of this book were so well done, particularly the way she explores the impact of the First World War on the women kind of left at home, on refugees, on people in certain communities. I thought this was just such a well done book. It also looks at women in education, the city of Oxford, and how there was a divide between the students and the people who were just kind of born and raised in Oxford. It was all really well done, apart from the autism representation. So the main character in this is not disabled. As far as I know, she isn't written to be autistic, although her twin sister, who features heavily in the story, Maud, is autistic. So Maud has echolalia, as well as being autistic. Echolalia is something that can occur in autistic people in particular, and involves a way of communicating that predominantly involves repeating words and phrases. And Maud, I believe in this book, only really communicates in this way. And just, there are just so many issues. Honestly, I've written like 3 pages of notes for this, and now I'm sitting here thinking, like, I just don't even know where to start. So it really kind of affected me, this book. And I think the reason it upset me so much is because it's almost there. Like, it's almost really good representation, and then it sort of just ends up being horribly problematic. So from very early on, from in the first chapter, we read, the book is written from Peggy's point of view. Peggy is Maud's sister. She's the main character. And both Maud and Peggy work in the Bookbindery at Oxford University. From very early on, in Peggy's point of view, we learn that she feels quite held back by having to care for Maud. That she's quite resentful of Maud. That she feels she can't do certain things, move forward in life because of Maud. As the book unfolds, she has other obstacles put in her way, being working class, being female, all of those things. But it's kind of a constant refrain throughout the book how much Peggy feels held back by Maud and how she feels quite resentful of her. Now, I know that this is probably quite realistic for some people. It isn't easy to be a carer. We're only human. We often resent other people, even people that we love. But it is just so constant. It is such a constant refrain. It's something we are repeatedly witnessing go through Peggy's mind. I'm not sure what the author was trying to do here. When I first started reading it, and those parts made me wince a little, but my assumption was that Peggy was going to go on a journey with this. The sisters' relationship feels quite central to the novel, so I assumed it would probably be quite a lot of growth and development around this. And although at one point, which I'll get onto, it does feel like that's going to happen, in the end it doesn't. And so we're right near the end of the book, and we're still hearing this kind of repetitive refrain of how Maud is holding Peggy back. And there's never any kind of resolution to that or any growth with that. And it just was painful to read as an autistic person and a disabled person who sometimes needs care. My partner is my carer. I think many people with autism and or disabilities will know that feeling of worrying about being a burden, of being acutely sensitive to the idea that you're being a burden to your loved ones. And so this is obviously my personal stuff, and it's obviously very subjective, but I just found this so difficult to just keep reading. It was so stressed. And because it doesn't really go anywhere, I just didn't really understand what the author was trying to do, other than use Maud as this almost constant sort of antagonist to Peggy, the main character. And that just felt like a really odd choice, an odd narrative choice for an author, to make a character autistic, almost to be this kind of constant irritant to the main character. I'm not saying that's in any way what the author was trying to do. I'm sure she was probably trying to do very different things, and many people may read this completely different to me, but that is definitely how I felt it came across, because of this just constant repetitiveness of Peg's feelings about her sister. Another thing that I found really problematic was that, and again, it could be quite realistic, but it just never really goes anywhere, is that Peg is often quite unkind to Maud. We see her snapping at her, being quite irritated by her, very much sometimes even telling her off as if she's a small child when she's her twin sister. They're both in their early 20s, so she's a grown woman. She tells her to stop swearing, even though she, Peggy, herself swears. She kind of keeps kissing her on the forehead as if she's a small child. It just, I don't know, it just feels that she doesn't really treat her sister very nicely, but this isn't really addressed within the novel. You know, at no point is Peggy kind of like, maybe I should be a bit nicer to my sister. Maybe I'm being a bit, I'm supposed to be her carer. Yes, it's hard work, but maybe I shouldn't sort of take my resentments out on her. It just feels like there's this constant, along with the thoughts that we get of how Peggy feels Maud is holding her back, there's just this constant sense that Maud is a burden to Peggy. And because, like I said, it never really goes anywhere, it's just there. I just don't understand what the author was trying to do. If it was trying to paint a realistic picture of being a carer, but even so, surely you're writing a fiction novel. Surely you need to be sensitive also to the autistic character, to autistic people who may be reading the book. I couldn't help thinking as I was reading this that the author perhaps had assumed that autistic people just aren't going to pick this book up, that maybe we just don't read. I don't know. I'm not trying to say that Pip Williams is an ableist person or anything like that. I don't know her, I don't know her background, but for me personally, the way this was written, I couldn't help asking myself, does this author have a really big blind spot when it comes to autistic people? In the acknowledgements at the back of the book, she says this: I am particularly grateful to the people who have held me to account for the way I write about particular lived experiences, including autism and echolalia. I'm going to assume from that the author is neurotypical and doesn't have much experience with autism. And I think it shows. The fact that she obviously sought out people who do have experience with autism, it doesn't say whether that's lived experience or whether they're carers or activists or anything like that, but that she did seek that out, I think is commendable. But I think it's indicative that she perhaps doesn't have much experience with autism herself, and then perhaps is, because of that, is drawing on societal stereotypes. Because there were lots of times when, in some ways Maud was quite well drawn. I thought the way her echolalia was portrayed was quite realistic in some areas. I don't have echolalia, so again, I can't speak to that from lived experience. There were some areas in which parts of the book felt quite well done and sensitive, and then others in which it was very much the opposite. And by the end of the book, I felt that Maud had become a stereotype, very much so. Almost of this sort of innocent, childlike, yet wise savant. That's not an uncommon stereotype for autistic people in fiction in the media, and I felt that Pip Williams really drew on that for the character of Maud, which is obviously really problematic. Autistic people aren't stereotypes. There may be some commonalities between us. But if you're trying to do representation and do it in a nuanced way, I think drawing on this kind of almost like the wise fool stereotype is, if it's not the way to do it. And the thing that I thought was quite weird, and this is perhaps why I was expecting Peggy and Maud's relationship to develop in more fruitful ways, was because there's part of the book where Peg talks about how she's aware that people misinterpret her sister, that in fact Maud is a lot more sort of aware, than people think she is, that people tend to infantilize her. Peg has obviously got quite a good awareness in some passages of the way her sister can be misconstrued and the way her echolalia can be misconstrued, and yet then she just continues to treat her the way she does. It almost feels like, and there's one page in particular where the author discusses Maud's echolalia. So in this paperback edition, it's 180. And it says here, Ma had known different. Maud didn't find it easy to compose an original sentence, but she chose what to repeat. She understood, I think, that most of what people said was meaningless, that people spoke to fill the silence or pass the time, that despite our mastery of words and our ability to put them together in infinitely varied ways, most of us struggled to say what we really meant. Maud filtered conversation like a prism filters light. She broke it down so that each phrase could be understood as an articulation of something singular. The truth of what she said could be inconvenient. Sometimes it made life easier for people to misunderstand her. I felt that was a really insightful passage. And when I read that, I got, so this is about a third of the way through the book, I started feeling quite excited that we were, like I said, we were going to see a lot of development in Peggy and Maud's relationship. And the things that I was wincing at the beginning of the book were kind of there to contrast to how it was going to grow and develop. And that just doesn't happen. So we have these occasional passages like this where there's quite a lot of insight, and insight from the main character as well. But then she never acts on that. She doesn't treat Maud like this is what she thinks. She treats Maud in some ways just not horribly, but as I said, she's quite irritable with her. She can be unkind. There's never really a sense that she really loves Maud. I think it would be easier to kind of read about the resentment and the feeling of being held back, which, as I said, carers do not get enough support in our society now. They certainly weren't getting any in 1914. Those feelings would be very human, but that's never contrasted with any feeling of love between the sisters. It's not as if, these are the complexities of the relationship. It just always seems to be this kind of underlying resentment. It was just really uncomfortable reading. And I think the existence of passages like that I did find so insightful, made the rest of it that more obvious. Kind of moving on from there. So the book sort of reaches its peak in the middle almost, in terms of, I thought, of the plot and the conflict. And chapter 29 in particular, I thought it was an excellently written chapter. It was very emotional. I felt it was a real sort of emotional sucker punch. It made me cry in one area. I won't give away spoilers in case you want to read the book. But there's a situation where, because of Peggy leaving Maud on her own to go and kind of do her own thing, Maud potentially gets into a dangerous situation. That then triggers off the reaction from Maud's friend, Lot, and we learn more about Lot's backstory, which is heart-wrenching. And this is a really well-written chapter, like I said, really emotional, really evocative. And so when I read this, I thought we were then going to get kind of much more of this, and that Peggy was kind of going to have a reckoning with some of the ways in which she treats Maud. Maybe that would be sort of less problematic if Maud herself was not such a one-note character. Like, yes, some people who have autism, who are autistic, aren't very expressive, or maybe quite introverted, or not show their emotions in ways that neurotypical people find it easy to understand. But autistic people aren't kind of one-note, one-dimensional people, and that's how Maud is written. Even though we see Maud interacting with a lot of people, and she clearly has in some ways quite a full life, we just don't ever see her reactions to anything. Obviously, because of her echolalia, it's sometimes hard to understand her words, or what she means by her words. But most communication, most human communication is non-verbal anyway. And although autistic people, and this is something I resonate with, don't always understand cues and can miss kind of non-verbal cues, we're still not one-note people. Maud just ends up being so flat. I don't personally find her very representative of autistic people. And of course, autistic people are vastly different. I'm not trying to represent everybody here. But for me, we never see Maud change. She doesn't, there's no growth, there's no development, there's no sense of her internal world at all. She never has a meltdown, she never has a shutdown, she never seems angry, she never seems particularly exuberant unless it's portrayed in this really childlike way. She just feels flat, and that means that she ends up feeling like a stereotype. And to me, I think the biggest problem I think I had with Maud is that she feels like a plot device. It feels as though the author decided to give the character a twin sister who was autistic, to give the character another hurdle to get over, so that as well as the kind of societal issues that were going on around her, she also had a more personal problem to get over. And it feels like that is what Maud is in this narrative. She's a plot device. She's an obstacle for the protagonist. And to read that as an autistic person, to see an autistic character being used in that way, it was quite painful. And again, I'm not trying to say that Pip Williams even intended to do that. She may have had very, very different intentions. And other autistic people may read this completely differently and disagree with me. Reading's always very subjective. But that did come across quite strongly to me, and it did make me feel really uncomfortable. And one of the things I think that made that quite jarring compared to the rest of the book is that there are other disabilities represented in this book. Because it's the First World War and we see soldiers returning home and Belgian refugees coming to the UK, and many of them have been injured and many of them are left with disabilities. There's a love interest in this book with disabilities, and those things I think are portrayed well. And Peg is much more sympathetic to those people, and there is a lot more we're given in the book, much more social commentary and context of the society that those disabled people are having to navigate, of the way that society treats them, of the way that there isn't enough support for them. So it's actually done, some of the disability representation in this book is done very well. It's quite nuanced, it's quite complex. And there's none of that for Maud. Her autism almost exists in a vacuum. There's no kind of sense of how it would be to be autistic in that day and time. I think there's a little mention that she found it hard to make friends at school. There's a situation where she may potentially get taken advantage of. On the whole, everyone is lovely to Maud. Everyone is really understanding, really caring, to the point that once again Pip seems to almost feel resentful because Maud gets attention, including off their mother, which I could understand in a sibling relationship. But that's also portrayed with the people around them. And I just don't find that realistic. I don't find that realistic in today's society, never mind in 1914. That everybody would just automatically be so lovely to Maud. I just don't think that's how it would have been. If you look at the time period, I mean, autism, of course, wasn't recognised in 1914. It wasn't diagnosed as that. Maud instead would have been seen as something called, and this is a hugely offensive term then and now, but probably the least offensive, so probably the only one I can say. She would be seen as something called feeble-minded, which is just such an awful term. And she would also have been, the R word slur would have been used to describe her, even by doctors. There's a good chance that if Maud presented with echolalia in childhood, that people would have tried to institutionalise her. None of that is apparent in this book. And I'm not saying that all books should have lots of social commentary if they're trying to represent minorities. That, you know, if it's a domestic drama, it wouldn't make sense to kind of weave those things into a story more than would be realistic. But that's the point. It's there for the other disabled people in this book, and Pip Williams weaves it into the story really well. So why is it not there for Maud? You know, if we think that 1914, the eugenics movement was rapidly on the rise, you know, and was about to culminate in a movement that would have seen people like Maud sterilised, locked away, even unalived, the just complete lack of context around Maud's autism in this, and the way it's almost used, as I said, as some kind of plot device to prop up the main character and her life issues, especially considering the time it's written, it's set in. I just can't understand the author's narrative choices. She's clearly a talented author. She's an amazing writer. She's been able to explore so many nuanced and complex issues in this book. So it really stood out to me how problematic the betrayal of Maud is. And as I said, I can't help but come away with the feeling that the author has a massive blind spot where autistic people are concerned. And so this was a really difficult read for me, made more difficult by the fact that it could have been fantastic. I'd love to know if anyone else has read this book, particularly if they're autistic, how you felt about Maud's portrayal in this book. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Do you have a completely different take I may not have thought of? Please let me know in the comments. I think one thing that I personally would take away from reading these two books and concentrating on their representation of disability is the need for own voices. And this is, you can find the hashtag own voices on social media. If you click on that, you will find lots and lots of works written by people with lived experience of the things they're writing about. And quite often, I think that when people with lived experience of being in a particular minority write about that, it just obviously comes across as more authentic. That doesn't mean it's not always problematic, or that authors who don't have lived experience can't write brilliant representation. But it's my opinion that own voices, as well as being really important because it allows marginalised authors a place in the world of publishing and writing that has historically been denied to them. I also think it does often offer, I'm not going to say better representation, but certainly more authentic representation. And just personally, as a disabled person, I like to read works by other disabled authors, by other autistic authors. I'm not one of those people that believe that writers can't write about things they don't have lived experience in, because otherwise I think writers would be able to write very little, or we'd only ever be able to write about, one or two things. And I don't think that would make for a very good body of work. But I do think that quite often own voices is kind of the key to getting that kind of really good representation that runs less risk of being problematic. But maybe you disagree. Let me know in the comments. Let me know if you have examples of authors who have written about something that's way outside of their lived experience and portrayed it, you think, beautifully. Do let me know, particularly if you're from that lived experience group. And I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it dealt with some quite heavy themes. Please do go and try both of these books if they take your fancy. Don't ever let a book reviewer's opinions put you off if you did want to read a book, because your opinion might be very different. And it's always important, I think, to get a wide range of opinions and feelings from people about any kind of work of art, work of fiction. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do like, please do subscribe, please do share. It really helps, especially as I'm still very new to BookTube. I will be back next week with a summer reading wrap up. So again, please subscribe if you'd like to get the notifications for that. And I'll see you then.